Yo, how's it going everybody? You got Sketch here and welcome back to the channel. And on today's episode we're taking a look at a title which is a continuation on developer NMK that never made it to arcades outside of Japan until earlier this year, getting a Switch and PS4 port via Hamster back in February. Today we're checking out Thunder Dragon 2, developed and published by NMK for the Japanese arcades, releasing in 1993. This does a few things differently compared to the original, yet has a rather familiar feel once you start digging into the game's 8 challenging stages. Much like each other NMK release we've looked at so far, it's another solid shoot 'em up that's easy to pick up but difficult to master. Quick question, what's the story about here though? Well, once again there really is no overarching plot, so the concept is simple. Jump in your jet and shoot down as many enemies as possible and defeat the final boss at the end. The extra loops from the original are gone in the sequel, and once clearing the final encounter, the credits begin to roll. That's pretty much it. Thunder Dragon 2 doesn't explain much, it just gets right to the action, similar to past titles, and doesn't let up until the last round is fired. Gameplay wise, the style remains mostly intact from the original with a few alterations, like the character sprite now being planes instead of helicopter type crafts. You'll fly through 8 stages, each of which are pretty challenging, especially on the back end of the run. Notably different from the previous entry is the power-up system, where instead of the compile-esque style of numbered capsules, is now simplified to bomb and weapon upgrade icons, which once maxed out, lays down some serious firepower. Even off the rip, Thunder Dragon 2 starts off pretty challenging and really only goes up from there. Enemies will come at you in similar formations from the original, like the enclosing circle, along with a few others you might recognize, while also tossing in a few new tricks to keep players guessing. This entry also plays a fair bit quicker than the past chapter, and the controls feel nice and snappy here. Your attacks also remain similar from the original game, being your base Vulcan shot, missiles, and screen clearing bombs. You can also net bonuses by grabbing jewel icons that drop from enemies downed in a combo, or even 50k plus bonuses dropped by larger enemies and mid-bosses throughout the stage. Shooting parts of the surrounding can also reveal hidden bonus icons, so shoot everything you can. Only catch is, with all the points you can rack up, a continue will reset your score, and deaths will reset bomb stocks, while also dropping your power level back to the base, though you can recover whatever upgrades you dropped if you get hit. There's also no extends or extra lives either, so what you fly in with is what you got until using a continue. Bonus points can also be gained by shooting the text in the beginning of stages and during the credit sequence, which can net a lot of points if you clear them before they leave the screen. The challenge ratchets up fairly quick here, but since you spawn in right where you leave off, there's no real consequence for dying aside from losing your score and bomb surplus. That's not to say this is easy, because even with its forgiving aspects, Thunder Dragon 2 will absolutely body you until players become more familiar with patterns, crowd control, and optimizing damage. Still, this is a really fun and accessible shooter that's got replay appeal, especially if you're after 1cc runs, even more so if you're trying to go for no-hit runs, which if you can manage either of those feats, then hats off to you. Graphics wise, Thunder Dragon 2 looks sick with its updated art style, elevating the designs and concepts from the previous entry. Environments are nicely detailed and often have a fair bit going on in the background while the carnage unfolds. Each locale is about what we'd expect to see, granted while all being drawn immaculately while keeping the foundation seen a couple years prior. There's no space stations this time around, but the grounded nature works out well here in regards of level designs. Compared to the first game, in absence of the interstellar levels, you got highly polished planet-based levels, which is interesting considering Zed Blade was on the horizon, which somewhat bridged the gap with its missing interstellar combat. Enemy sprites have also been upgraded with massive character models, and even the basic enemies are larger and highly detailed compared to the first game. It's interesting to note how the first game had a pretty heavy focus on mech suit enemies, and in the sequel, aside from some boss characters, you don't see much of them at all. Variety is still plentiful though, with more modern aircraft and ground-based enemy vessels. Boss sprites aren't anything too out of the ordinary for an NMK release, starting out with more grounded major enemies initially, then getting into more mechanical and almost alien prototype style crafts and fortresses. These do have a lot of detail with the models and animations similar in style to Gunnail, which released earlier that year. Yet these sprites do look arguably sharper and a bit more full-bodied. You'll see a few of the usual suspects, but there's a few that get pretty spicy here, not just with their designs, but also with their attack patterns, which do get pretty wild towards the end. The short cutscenes that were in the original are also gone and replaced by shooting the text at the start of each stage, and the ending cutscene gets the same treatment, allowing you to shoot all the credit text, which is pretty funny and counts towards your final score. It's an interesting sequel that pares down certain aspects and mainly hones in on performance and visual detail with solid presentation that pulls you in despite having no explanation. There's also a section that looks like it could be a possible Easter egg of Konami's Jackal, featuring a level that looks identical to the game's opening stage with Jeeps as the enemy type, which also would be pretty awesome if that were the intention. Thunder Dragon 2 smashes it visually with its more practical approach while really polishing their art style and techniques. It's a smooth looking as well as playing shoot 'em up, and it's truly interesting that it never made it to the stateside arcades or got a port prior to the Switch and PS4 versions, considering how solid this game is. Sound wise, Thunder Dragon 2 straight up bangs, and the audio is smoking on all cylinders. The soundtrack, while only having a couple backing tracks during play, are a couple of belters, and the recurring boss tune does slap. The final boss tune also goes pretty hard before leading into a chill ballad as the credits begin to crawl. Hideo Kazunori is back in the booth as a supervisor this go around, overseeing Zutaro, and their combined efforts are pretty killer. This also coincides with what I mentioned earlier, saying that there's less of certain ingredients here, but the ones that are there are well seasoned. The audio department is pretty fire here with some nice punchy sound bits that got a bit more bass than the last entry. The banter of the pilots is also sprinkled throughout each stage while you down enemies, and the voice synth is deeper and a bit more distorted in tone, sounding a little more robotic this time around. While you get a surprisingly hefty handful of voice lines depending on what's happening, and like if you're crushing it, you hear things like, okay, who's next? Or yeah, get out of my sight. Or if you're getting clapped and lose all of your stocks, you'll hear something like, oh no, it's over. Or it's time to put in more coins, man, as you get shot down. It's really interesting to have a somewhat play-by-play commentary added into the mix with a bit of personality, which is a lot more pronounced than before. Gunfire and explosions also got a lot of bass to them here this time around, certainly up in the ante from the first game. The audio as a whole feels like a combination of late 80s and early 90s action movies with vibes of American and Asian cinema, combining into some pretty solid effects work. The gunfire and explosion sounds remind me a lot of the Foley art you hear in Chinese and Korean cinema, especially at the crossover martial arts and pistol opera kind of stuff, so that rules. Long story short, the audio here is on point, keeping the energetic feel from the jump to the finish line. Thunder Dragon 2 is an excellent follow-up to the already solid first entry that, while retaining the same feel of the original, takes it a few notches further and refines it. It's also a slightly shorter run compared to the first game with only 8 non-looping stages, but it's got a hell of a lot of action in those stages that will challenge players of every skill level. You get unlimited credits, so you got plenty of room to learn optimal strategies while going for those bigger scores and bonuses, though be prepared to get worked until you get comfortable with everything. Those that have played the original may notice the differences, though either of the Thunder Dragon games are great vertical shooters to try. With that, Thunder Dragon 2 gets an 8.5 out of 10 and comes highly recommended to vertical shoot 'em up and shooter fans in general, since this is a solid title with a fair challenge. Developer NMK is often a safe bet with quality titles, and their shoot 'em ups always do something unique while being fun to run through at least a few times. This, along with their forthcoming Zed Blade in 1994, would hit the scene and make some waves and solidify their pedigree of their releases. Zed Blade is another one we'll talk about relatively soon, as it will be NMK's last arcade release. You really can't go wrong with any of the NMK titles available via the arcade archives, but amongst them, this and the original games are prime picks. If you're into breakneck vertical shooters, these both are a great place to start. And thank you so much if you've made it this far into the video. If you find these videos helpful, that's awesome. I'm glad you can find this as a resource. Check back often. We'll have more reviews and commentaries coming up in the near future. Until then, take it easy and stay safe out there. I'll see you on the next one.